A step, two-step, three-step, boom. That's what Ukraine has planned for Russia in 2026, as it's just unveiled a genius, three-pronged approach designed to end Russia's war instantly. Devised by Ukraine's innovative strategists, this plan has been crafted to hit Russia where it hurts, in Ukraine and inside Russia itself. And it also takes away some of the key advantages that Russia has held since the beginning of the war. Make sure you stick around until the end of the podcast, where we'll reveal how Ukraine is going to turn its plan into a reality so it can cripple Russia. But first, let's focus on the first of the three steps, closing Ukraine's skis to Russia forever. That's what Ukraine's Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov says will be the first stage of a three-step plan to completely end Russia's war against Ukraine. In a post on Telegram, Fedorov explained the reason behind this strategy, stating, "It's pretty clear why Ukraine is kicking off its Russia-crippling plan with a boost in its air defenses. Russia's drones, missiles, and guided bombs are perhaps the most important tools that Putin has, not just for weakening Ukraine's military, but for terrorizing its people." In January alone, Russia launched 91 ballistic missiles at Ukraine, which is the highest monthly total since the invasion. Those 91 ballistic missiles were part of airstrikes that saw Russia fire a total of 158 missiles, about 5,500 guided aerial bombs, and over 6,000 attack drones at Ukraine. It's pretty clear that Putin's plan is to overwhelm Ukraine's air defenses, and Russia has been doing a better job of that than anybody would like. Throughout the winter, Russia has launched an intense campaign against Ukraine's energy grid that, at one point toward the end of January, had left more than 1.2 million Ukrainians without power. Russia's airstrikes target civilians more than they target the military, and we also see that in the sheer number of civilian casualties that Ukraine has experienced. According to data gathered by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Russia has inflicted 56,550 civilian casualties on Ukraine up to January 31, 2026. That breaks down to 15,172 civilians killed and 41,378 wounded, and these are only the casualties that the UN has been able to confirm. It's inaccurate to say that airstrikes are the only cause of these casualties, but they are perhaps the biggest contributor, as Russia's missiles, drones, and bombs rain down on Ukrainian cities almost every single week. Fedorov explains that Ukraine already has a plan in place to minimize the impact of Russia's aerial assaults, the completion of which will also round off the first step in Ukraine's three-stage strategy. The creation of a multi-level, small air defense system and the scaling of interceptors have already been launched. Important organizational changes have begun, Fedorov states, adding that when the sky is closed, the country functions. The mention of interceptors is important. One of the key roles that Russia's attack-type drones serve, beyond causing damage if they manage to hit their targets, is sucking up Ukraine's air defense resources. A Shahid-type drone only costs Russia about $35,000 to make, and that's hardly the kind of target on which Ukraine wants to waste an air defense missile that might have cost 5 or 10 times as much. Far better for Ukraine is to come up with a form of air defense that allows it to take out Shahid-type drones using a weapon that costs less to build, which in turn means that Russia wastes more money than it's able to extract out of Ukraine with each of its drone swarms. Enter the interceptor drone. United 24 Media reported on February 24th that Ukraine has significantly increased the effectiveness of its interceptor drones, which now account for the destruction of 30% of the projectiles that Russia launches at Ukraine. Each of these drones is cheap and can be produced at scale, with Ukraine only spending between $3,000 and $5,000 per unit. In other words, an interceptor that takes out a Shahid type not only potentially saves a target inside Ukraine, but also costs Russia $35,000. Multiply that by thousands upon thousands of destroyed Shahids, and you get Ukraine spending relatively little to burn a massive hole in Russia's war chest. That might just be a little hint for the third stage of Ukraine's new strategy. But before we get to that, we need to cover stage 2. With the skis guarded, ideally to the point where Ukraine manages a 95% interception rate for Russia's projectiles, Ukrainian civilians and soldiers on the ground can get to work with a little less fear. They can also focus on the task at hand, which is making Russia bleed soldiers and equipment for every scrap of territory they manage to capture in Ukraine. The idea here is that a death-dealing defense is as good as a strong offense, because it puts Russia in a position where it has to expend far more resources than it has available. And that is stage 2, bleed Russia dry on the ground, at sea, and in cyberspace. The first of those areas seems to be Fedorov's primary focus, as he explains in his Telegram post. The front line is holding thanks to the unwavering heroism of Ukrainian soldiers. The enemy pays for every kilometer of Ukrainian land. In the Donetsk region, there are 156 soldiers per square kilometer. Our benchmark is over 200 killed occupiers per square kilometer, Fedorov declares. The logic here is pretty simple. Russia has X number of soldiers. If Ukraine can destroy Y amount, which is more than X per square kilometer, then it burns Russia's entire military to the ground. Ukraine has some way to go if it's going to achieve this goal. In 2025, Russia managed to capture 4,831 square kilometers in Ukraine, per the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW. That figure may be debatable, as Russia made of falsely claiming territory captures that it hadn't actually made toward the tail end of 2025, as Putin scrambled to gain some sort of leverage that he could use in peace talks. But if we take that number as a given, we can use it to work out Russia's casualty rate per square kilometer in 2025. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Russia suffered about 415,000 casualties last year. If we divide that by 4,831, we get a casualty rate of almost 86 Russian troops for each square kilometer. Fedorov wants more than double that rate. Is that even possible? If the early stages of 2026 are anything to go by, Ukraine may already be on the right track. According to an ISW report published on February 20th, Russia has seized 572 square kilometers of Ukraine between January 1st and what we assume is February 19th, as the ISW would have needed time to compile its report before the February 20th publication. That amounts to 50 days of warfare in which Russia has managed to occupy 11.44 square kilometers of Ukraine per day. Multiply that figure by the 31 days in January, and you get 354.64 kilometers. According to Al Jazeera, Ukraine has estimated that Russia has suffered 31,680 casualties in January. But some quick maths tells us that Russia's casualty rate per square kilometer gain now sits at 89.3. It's not a huge increase over 2025, but it is an increase, and it's the first step toward Ukraine pushing toward the 200 casualties per square kilometer that Fedorov wants to see. There's also a little bit of a twist in this tale that we're going to reveal in a moment. Ukraine's defense minister dubs that magical 200 number as the rate of attrition that Ukraine must inflict on Russia to make advancement through Ukraine impossible. Up until 200, every increase in casualties per square kilometer will at least force Russia to slow down. There's nothing wrong with having ambitious goals, and Ukraine knows exactly what it needs to achieve to make Putin's invasion too costly for Russia from a manpower perspective. There are also signs that Ukraine is well on its way toward forcing Russia to make some difficult decisions about manpower. For one, Russia's recruiting appears to be collapsing. According to The Telegraph, Western analysts believe that Russia has been recruiting fewer soldiers than it's been losing for the past 3 months of the war, leading up to February. According to the outlet, Russia is recruiting around 35,000 soldiers per month. But hold on a second. We just told you that Ukraine itself estimated that Russia lost 31,680. If that's the case, then 35,000 recruits per month means that Russian recruitment is exceeding its losses. That's where the twist we mentioned a minute ago comes into play. But before we go deeper into that, you're listening to Military Radio, and we bring you the full picture, not just the headlines. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you're always ahead of the curve. So there's something strange going on with the maths that we just shared. And that something is that 31,680 isn't actually Russia's casualty rate for January 2026. It's Russia's death toll. In other words, these are all soldiers who have been eliminated from the battlefield altogether. They're done. They're never coming back, dead. When you add other casualties, which include the wounded and soldiers who have been taken as prisoners of war, Russia's casualty rate is actually closer to 40,000 soldiers per month. Let's plug that number into the sums we shared earlier. If Russia lost 40,000 soldiers for the 354.64 square kilometers that it gained in January, assuming our averages are correct, that puts Russia's actual casualty rate at 112.7 per square kilometer. That's still not the magic 200 that Fedorov wants, but it's a heck of a lot closer. If Ukraine is able to ramp up its destruction of Russia's forces throughout 2026, the ambitious goal of 200 casualties per square kilometer may soon start looking less like a pie-in-the-sky idea and more like a reality for which Russia has absolutely no answer. According to Artem Belenkov, who is the chief of staff of Ukraine's formidable Nemesis battalion, Ukraine's goal is now to expand its lethal kill zones, which are the drone-infested defenses that are already churning through Russia's soldiers. The goal is to extend their size by 25 kilometers or around 15.5 miles. If the Russians get to our position, they should be totally exhausted and have been walking for 20 to 25 kilometers, Belenkov tells Euractiv. And it's simple logic. Every extra kilometer that Russian soldiers have to walk through the kill zones creates more time that Ukraine can use to find and kill them before they can ever reach the fortified positions. Death already awaits the vast majority of Russians who stray into these kill zones. Making them larger and more lethal is going to help Ukraine creep even closer to 200 Russian casualties per square kilometer occupied. Fedorov has more ideas, which he explains in his Telegram post. We know how to achieve this. There is a specific list of solutions and projects, from improving the procurement system and completing the core reform to transforming the training and command systems based on data, Ukraine's defense minister says. It looks like there is a wholesale transformation of Ukraine's entire military structure underway, and if that transformation leads to more efficient units, better use of data, and faster procurement, it will translate to even more Russian casualties. Each of those casualties costs Russia money, as does the loss of equipment that often comes along with them. And that brings us nicely to the third phase of the three-pronged strategy, which will see Ukraine build on something that it's been doing for months now: deprive Russia of the economic resources that it needs to fight. Fedorov is as aware as anyone else that Russia can always buy more when it has money. Signing fees can be increased to lure volunteers into signing contracts who might otherwise have stayed well away from Ukraine. Money allows Russia to build missiles and other weapons, all of which are used against Ukraine. If you cut the arteries that pump money into Russia, you create a state that can't bankroll Putin's insane invasion. The war continues because Russia has money for missiles and drones, for contracts for soldiers, for propaganda, Fedorov declares. And the reason why Russia can spend so heavily on all of these things comes down to its most important resource, oil. So the third part of Ukraine's three-pronged strategy is going to see it working alongside its partners to take aim squarely at the Russian shadow fleet. Russia sells it all over the world through the so-called shadow fleet. It's from this budget that the war is financed. If this channel is cut off, the resources for war will be sharply reduced. What is needed? Stronger sanctions, coordination with partners, a strategy to counter the shadow fleet, joint actions with partners at sea, Fedorov says, and he is absolutely on the right track. The shadow fleet has been Russia's lifeline since Putin invaded. As sanctions weighed heavily on Russia, Putin built a fleet of aging tankers that Russia has been using to evade the sanctions for years. The numbers related to the shadow fleet are murky, which is unsurprising given the fleet's nature. Back in December, United 24 Media reported that the shadow fleet contains over 1,240 vessels, which combine to transport about 69% of all of Russia's seaborne oil that it exports to other countries. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Russia's shady fleet generates anywhere between $87 and $100 billion in revenue per year, all of which is money that the Kremlin can tax to feed Putin's voracious appetite for the Ukraine invasion. That's the economic lifeline that Ukraine needs to sever. Destroying the shadow fleet isn't really an option, though Ukraine has enjoyed some success in the past with attacks on shadow fleet vessels, including a December strike on the Kendal in which Ukraine sent drones into the Mediterranean Sea. Over 1,200 ships is a massive amount. Russia can also buy more, especially as it's buying aging tankers that are barely even seaworthy, so it's getting its shadow fleet vessels at cut prices. What needs to happen, as Fedorov says, is increased collaboration between Ukraine and its many partners to ensure that the shadow fleet has a much harder time sailing oil to the countries to which Russia sells. Sanctions and blockades help, though Russia is often quick to evade both by switching flags and creating new shell companies that obscure where the shadow fleet ships operate from. Isolated seizures also get the headlines, as the Royal United Services Institute points out, but they don't do enough to stop the entire fleet. What really needs to happen, RUSI says, is that the collective West needs to stop enabling the shadow fleet by selling tankers and making it too easy for Russia to evade sanctions. Greece is highlighted as a country that has sanctions against Russia as part of the European Union, but has also helped Russia build its shadow fleet stock with sales of vessels. For RUSI, and likely for Ukraine, real change only comes if the West collectively gets on board with backing up its shadow fleet rhetoric. Some positive steps have been taken. For instance, the group of 7 nations has created a Shadow Fleet Task Force, which has been joined by the Nordic Baltic 8++ to create a network of countries committed to cracking down on the Shadow Fleet. RUSI adds that such task forces will do well to involve countries in the South China Sea, where Shadow Fleet ships operate with impunity and have already placed other maritime traffic at peril. In short, more needs to be done. And if Ukraine can complete the first two phases of its three-stage plan, it will be able to focus more of its effort on working alongside its partners to ruin the shadow fleet. A coordinated campaign of seizures and loophole closing will cost Russia billions of dollars in oil sales, and that's all money that the Kremlin won't be able to tax at a time when its budget deficit already looks set to triple the official target that Russia set for itself in 2026. Every ounce of economic pain that Ukraine can inflict on Russia hurts Putin's war machine. Eventually, according to Fedorov, Ukraine wants to make the invasion as economically unviable for Russia as it is militarily unviable. Now, at the beginning of the podcast, we asked you to stick around to the end, where we would reveal how Ukraine intends to turn this plan into a reality. The question we need to ask now is, how do you execute a three-stage plan? By building a three-step implementation process. In wrapping up his Telegram post, Fedorov revealed the three things that Ukraine needs to do to make sure its ambitious plans come to fruition. First up, strengthen partnerships. Win-win cooperation to achieve record volume of international aid this year. With the purchase of drones, stable payments to the military, and strengthening air defenses and other needs of defense systems are the goals in the first phase of execution, Fedorov states. Add what Ukraine intends to do on the Shadow Fleet side, and you get a country that understands that making its relationships stronger with those who oppose what Putin is doing will lead to Russia becoming much weaker. As for the second step, this is all about ensuring that Ukraine maintains its technological advantage over Russia, to be at least 10 steps ahead of the enemy in every technological cycle. To maintain leadership in the innovation war is how Fedorov puts it, and this is an area where Ukraine has excelled. As National Interest puts it, Ukraine has turned itself into a steel porcupine that stabs Russia every time that Putin orders an assault. Constant innovation has defined everything that Ukraine does, to the point where around 80% of the casualties that Ukraine inflicts on Russia come at the hands of unmanned vehicles. With its interceptor drone plan, Ukraine is now turning that innovation toward its air defense. More will come as new unmanned vehicles are developed, and Ukraine increasingly implements artificial intelligence in ways that Russia can't even dream of. Ukraine has to excel in the mathematics of war. In other words, the more data that Ukraine has, the more it can hurt Russia. Thanks to the eBal system through Delta, we are already receiving high-quality data from the battlefield. The next step is to turn data into a decisive force, to see more, to think faster, to strike more precisely, Fedorov says. Through data, Ukraine can see airstrikes coming. It can learn more about Shadow Fleet ships, which allow it to work with partners to shut them down. And it can determine how successful its efforts are and what it needs to tweak in terms of hitting the goal of 200 Russian casualties per square kilometer. Data is everything for Ukraine, and it feeds into the innovation that is part and parcel of the second step for executing on its three-phase strategy. What we see in all of this is that Fedorov is a man with a plan, and that plan is so out of this world that it could destroy Russia's entire invasion. In some parts of Ukraine, Fedorov's plan, especially when it comes to innovating and inflicting casualties, is already well underway. The Lazar Group represents everything that Fedorov wants to see in the entire Ukrainian army, as it's become so efficient that it's turned hunting Russian soldiers into a 24/7 McDonald's-style operation. Find out what that means by listening to the podcast. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to Military Radio so you can catch more analysis of the latest moves that Ukraine makes to end Russia. And thank you, as always, for watching.